Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So just gonna wait for a bit of a sound check. If you can put in the section, comment section below, if you can hear me loud and clearly, please. Okay, Jazakallah khair, Salma. I think you've confirmed. You're the first one here, so I'll take your word for it. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So final session of this revision period. So year 10 will be complete. We'll be starting year 11 soon. And then before that though, don't get too excited, you've got your exam in about a week and a half time. All the details will be revealed. So I'm going to crack on with this third and final revision session. If there's any problems, if you can put it in the comments section as usual, I'm sure the team will pick it up or someone will make me aware of what's going on. So let's just start. Bismillah. So as you know, the way we format these slides is that the text will be in blue, the class positions will be in red, and I've made a few changes this year. There's going to be a few other colours, I'll let you work them out. But essentially the Quran, anything to do with the Quran will be in, what colour did I put it in? I think it was purple, I think, and anything to do with Hadith in green, but we'll work that out as we go along. So in the description of the prayer, we will be completing chapter 21 today. So I think we started it last year, but we'll be completing it this year. So this is the text. I will read it out inshallah. The Duha prayer is a sunnah. It is a minimum of 2 units and a maximum of 8. Its time is from the end of the prohibited time until just before the moment of zawal. The prostration for recitation is an actual prayer and is a sunnah. For the reciter and the one actively listening, but not for the one who merely hears it. If the reciter doesn't prostrate, neither does the listener. There are 14 prostrations, 2 within Surah Al-Hajj. One makes the takbir when prostrating and rising back up, then sits and offers the taslim, but doesn't do the tashahhud. It is disliked for the imam to recite a verse of prostration in a silent prayer and to prostrate therein. Those praying behind the imam must follow him in all other prayers. It is recommended to offer the prostration of thankfulness when a new blessing presents itself or harm is averted. If offered during a prayer, it will be invalidated, i.e. the prayer, other than for the one who is ignorant or forgetful. The prohibited times for general prayer are 5. 1. From the true dawn until sunrise. 2. From the sunrise until it has risen above the horizon the length of a spear. 3. From the zenith until it starts to descend. 4. After praying Asr until the beginning of sunset. 5. From the beginning of sunset until it is completed. It is permissible to make up missed obligatory prayers during all these times. It is also permissible to perform the 2 units of tawaf during the 3 short times, 2, 3 and 5, as well as to repeat a congregational prayer during them. It is not allowed to offer any prayers other than these during the prohibited times, even if they have a specific reason behind them. So that is the class text. You're glad to know that's 2 full slides. And surprisingly, there's a lot to cover, actually, maybe unsurprisingly. Now, the thing that we have to factor in today is Maghrib is in about 15-20 minutes. So in about 15-20 minutes time, we'll have a 5-minute break to pray Maghrib and then we'll resume. Hopefully I remember that. So let's get started. The Duha prayer is Sunnah. And we're going to discuss the minimum units. According to the Hanbali Madhab, According to our text, the minimum of 2 units and a maximum of 8. We'll come to the maximum in a second. So, what are the minimum units of duha prayer? A discussion comparing this is, some scholars have compared it to Salatul Witr, which can technically be 1 unit. We discussed this a long time ago, we won't discuss that here. But yes, technically, on rare occasions, the witr can be a 1 unit prayer. It's a sunnah prayer. And so therefore, technically, could this be possible for Salatul Duha? Shaykh al-Uthaymeen responds, witr is a unique situation which only happens for witr sometimes here and there. Again, we've discussed that, we're not going to discuss that here. But the nafil prayers, they're not obligated. We get rewarded for doing it, and as a general rule principle, they are 2 units. One of the evidences is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was giving a khutbah, and a person walked in, and he sat down, and the Prophet ﷺ paused and told him, stand and observe 2 rak'ah and make it light. So as you know, in a khutbah, everybody's attention is supposed to be on the khatib. But the Prophet ﷺ made a point of emphasizing to this person that actually he should do Tahiyatul Masjid, i.e. he should pray 2 nafil. Now we're going to use this hadith many times actually, from various different angles. On this occasion, the emphasis on the number that the Prophet ﷺ advised this person to pray. Later on, we're going to discuss completely different angles to the same hadith. Fascinating hadith, to be honest. So the first principle that we take from this hadith, that the minimum for this nafil prayer is 2 units. And that's the general principle that we take for now. Then we move on to the maximum. And the maximum, according to the madhab, is 8 units. And that would mean, when we take 8 units, we're talking about the 2 units, so there would be 4 taslims. Based on the hadith of Hani. Now, what is this hadith about? It's basically the Prophet ﷺ in the duha period praying 8 units in the presence of Hani at her home. Now, interestingly, Abdullah ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar were of the opinion, were of the opinion that no, they actually said that they didn't hold opinion on ad-duha, because they hadn't seen the Prophet ﷺ pray this prayer. Abdullah ibn Abbas changed his opinion though after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, because when he was at the house of Hani, he observed her praying this 8 rak'ah prayer, and basically was exposed to this duha prayer. So that's interesting from that point of view. But according to the Hanbalis, they are pretty strict on this maximum of 8 units. So much so, if a person was to pray 10 units within this period of time, at duha time, they would see the first 8 units as part of duha, and you get rewarded as part of duha. But the other 2 would not be a duha prayer. It would just be seen as a nafil prayer, which doesn't sound too bad, but it's a technical issue, and it would just see, but it's not a duha prayer. That's the main thing. They only see 8, no more than that. So but our class position actually, as Shaykh al-Uthaymeen explains, is that there is no limit, and we'll come to why. Now actually, so we discussed the minimum is 2, because that's the general principle, building blocks of nafil prayers, 2 units. We said the maximum is 8 based on Hani's hadith. However, we have narrations of 4, 6 also being prayed. The Prophet ﷺ prayed Salatul Duha regularly, different amounts. In a hadith from Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, prayed 4. And Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he prayed 6. The Prophet ﷺ prayed 6, and it was narrated by Abu Hurairah. So we can see that there's varying amounts here. And Shaykh al-Uthaymeen gives an analogy really, when he talks about Arafah and Hajj, and he talked about, and actually we could talk about lots of different examples about the Prophet ﷺ where he did things in a personal capacity. In this case, in Muzdalifah, he relieved himself and he did wudu. And in this situation, no scholar in history is suddenly going to make this a sunnah act. Why are we talking about this issue? As Abu Isa mentioned in the class, anything on that day of Yawm al-Arafah, It's in hyper focus, and anything the Prophet ﷺ does, the scholars are going to see as a big thing because it's on Arafah. We got to follow it. It's like the biggest day of the calendar year. But like we said, no scholar in history has said that this act of relieving oneself and doing wudu very quickly in Muzdalifah is an act to be followed, because it was just the Prophet ﷺ, human being, that needed to relieve himself and then did wudu afterwards. So it's important to know when it comes to in fiqh what actions and statements are to be followed, and what categories they fall in, and what is sunnah and what isn't sunnah. So that's an important point that the Shaykh Uthaymeen highlighted in this scenario. Shaykh Muhammad Mukhtar al-Shanqiti's opinion is that actually the duha prayer the maximum is 12. He said it shouldn't be just completely unrestricted, and we should, as Shaykh Uthaymeen is saying, and rather it's 12. Now, I'm going to own up here. The reasoning that we gave in class, he said that the reason it's 12 units is because we have hadith from which we can derive every unit all the way up to 12. I actually don't know what that means. That's why I've highlighted it in green. So if someone can explain to me, what that means, because 4, 6, 8, are we saying that they're all can be divided into 12? Or I don't actually know what that statement means. So if someone can explain to me. But irregardless, our class position, as it is at the bottom, is that it's unrestricted. The minimum is 2. 4, 6 and 8 have been done. 8 rak'ah is preferable maximum. However, if someone was to read more, no problem. It would still be counted as duha, not like as the Hanbalis would, who say, no, it's not duha after 8. And therefore, because it's technically unrestricted. So that's the class position. It's in red. Just a side point. Some people mentioned that this 12 number was, as we know, there's a famous hadith which talks about the regular sunnah during the day around the obligatory prayers. Some people actually said it doesn't refer to them. It's actually to do with the number of units to do with Salatul Duha. Interesting point, but not something that we follow in this regard. So moving on, Duha. Some of the ulama said that these 8 units of prayer was a unique prayer that the leader offers when they conquer the land. So a kind of a offering to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when victory is given to you, a major victory. So Fatih Makkah being one of them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, truly we have opened a path to clear triumph for you, i.e. the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions that this is one of the greatest blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give to the ummah, to a Muslim, opening up the lands and conquering the lands. And so, some people mentioned that this prayer was to do with that, but again, we've made it clear the duha prayer was very regularly done by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. On this point of people when a big victory happens and offering this prayer, and all the scholars believe that this prayer is has the evidences around it was to be done. So it's a matter of ijtihad, but we have some famous companions where they made a big point of it. So when in this case, when parts of Persia were conquered, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas prayed 8 rak'ah. So there's evidences there, but for duha, like I said, our class position minimum to a recommended maximum of 8, but it's technically unrestricted. So now we come to what time can you pray duha in? Now its time is from the end of the prohibited time until just the moment of zawal. So we're going to discuss these times really. So the time of duha starts from approximately 15 minutes after sunrise until just before zawal, which is again about 15 minutes before dhuhr time. And I've got a little interesting diagram that I want to show you, so we'll point this out. So we can bring in a few examples and talk about this really. So if you missed your sunnah prayer, you arrived at the masjid, so we're talking about Fajr, and the congregation has stood up and started. you should obviously pray with the Jama'ah. What do you do about the 2 Sunnah prayers that you've not been able to pray? Do you read it straight after? Do you read it during this 15-minute kind of haram time or makruh time? We've had these discussions many times, but in this scenario, you should offer it after that 15-minute period, because it's the prohibited time to pray. Now the scholars, so we've established the times of duha. Now what is the best time, because that's a big portion of time, and the scholars actually differed greatly. Shaykh Uthaymeen, for example, he said the best time to pray was really late in the day, based on the hadith in purple. So the hadith are in purple, sorry. The prayer of those who are penitent is observed when your weaned camels feel the heat of the sun. Now, so the main point here is when the heat becomes strong. And Shaykh Uthaymeen quotes this hadith that the prayer of the awwabin, the prayer of the repentant, is when the young camel feels the heat, and picked a very late time actually. So for Shaykh Uthaymeen, he picked, what time did I put there? Much later than what we picked. I've not actually put down what Shaykh Uthaymeen said in terms of the time he preferred. So some scholars say actually between 9 and 10 is the time. And one of the reasons, additional reasons that they said, is that actually it's a period of the day where it's quite far from Fajr, it's too early from Dhuhr, and it's a period of day where not much ibadah is done, a kind of dead period. So they picked that. But other scholars mentioned much earlier times. So we mentioned 7, half 7, 8 o'clock. Based on the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, son of Adam, perform 4 rak'ah for me in the beginning of the day. It will suffice you for the latter part of it. Our class position is around 9 to 10, whereas Shaykh Uthaymeen was much later, so you're looking at 11, 10, 11, maybe even a bit later. So our class position is 9 to 10. It's the time when it does become uncomfortably hot. You might be thinking here, what do you mean hot? We live in the UK. There's no such thing. But yeah, it's that period in the day where it is kind of between the 2 obligatory prayers and the Ishraq prayer, which we'll come to as well, which is prayed soon after sunrise. So we're also going to mention a few of the points that Sheikh Muhammad al-Mukhtar al-Shanqiti now mentions. The listing of the non-obligatory prayers doesn't seem to have a specific order, so that's not just what we've covered today, it's what we've covered in the previous sessions as well. So this is kind of a summary that we've talked about these non-obligatory prayers. Is there an order? Why have they been mentioned in the way that they have been? And should there be an order? For example, we talked about the Taraweeh prayer. It's been put in front of the 2 Sunnah of Fajr, but the Prophet ﷺ never missed the Sunnah prayer of Fajr. So surely that's going to be higher, whereas he had a very different approach to Taraweeh. So how do we kind of balance this up? And then on top of that, there are some prayers that haven't been mentioned at all. Are they not important? Do they not have the evidences? So one of those examples being the 2 units of wudu, a number of hadith. So we know that they're valid, which describe this for us, massive reward. One of the hadith is the hadith of Uqba ibn Amir. The hadith which is famous is the hadith of Uthman ibn Affan, in which he bought some water and completed a comprehensive ablution. So the perfect wudu. Sorry. He who performs. So this is the hadith. He who performs ablution like this, ablution of mine, and then stood up for prayer and offered 2 rak'ah of prayer without allowing his thoughts to be distracted, all his previous sins are expiated. So we take the minor sins from this. So we're going to actually mention some of these other non-obligatory prayers very quickly. Shall we mention them now? Let's have a look. What time is it? 20 past. What time was Maghrib today? So instead of jumping right in, we're going to mention these non-obligatory prayers. Let me just see how many slides there are. So there's no point in going through all of these yet. So what we'll do now is we will break for Maghrib, for those who need to pray Maghrib now. And so we'll give it 5 minutes. So 25 past, inshallah, we will resume. Assalamu alaikum. So we're back. So Ruhi is saying that the hadith of 12, one who prays 12 units a day, Allah will be... Yes, I mean we've that's fine. But it was Sheikh Muhammad Shankiti. What did he mean by it can be derived from the Doha prayers? The evidences that we have, they can all be kind of derived from 12. I couldn't get my head around that. That's fine. I take Maysa's point. So it was Aisha's hadith before. Not fair enough. Right. So let's crack on because we've got a lot to get through. So we're on the non-obligatory prayers, the ones that haven't been mentioned. One of them being istikhara. So the hadith of Jabir, the Prophet ﷺ said, used to teach the Prophet ﷺ used to teach us the way of doing istikhara in all matters, as he sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us surahs of the Quran. He sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if any one of you thinks of doing any job, he should offer 2 rak'ah prayer other than the obligatory. So it's interesting the wording that's used here, other than the obligatory. The reason being is that why not say sunnah or nafal? And this is an indication that for the prayer, whenever someone wants to do anything, this is the prayer that we kind of turn to. Now, this has been mentioned lots of times of how istikhara is used and what it's really for. And essentially, it's a prayer that blesses your decision. There's versions, but I've put one down there for you. So this is one of the non-obligatory prayers. Another one is, so this is a 2-unit prayer. When is istikhara done? So yes, I need to cover this as well. So it's 2-unit prayer, which are to be done in non-obligatory prayers. The intention can be added to other than the non-obligatory prayers. So the 2 sunnah fajr, for example, or it can be done in 2 rak'ah of duha. And the dua is made after the prayer, so giving the taslim. That's the position of the 4 imams, and it's generally been the position of the 4 madhabs. But Ibn Taymiyyah actually says, no, we'll do this istikhara, this dua, before taslim. It's a valid place for it to be done. And in today's age, as Abu Isa was mentioning, that we seem to do a lot of dua after the taslim, rightly or wrongly. According to the sunnah or not, that's a whole different discussion. But certainly what we know is from the sunnah is to do it within the prayer as well, and the specific portion of the prayer being just before the taslim. So the class position is that if we're going to do it, the dua of istikhara, then we should do it before the taslim. However, when I say should, if you do it after the taslim, no problem. It's a well-held position. We'll follow Ibn Taymiyyah on this one. Now, Salat al-Shuruq or al-Ishraq. Now, there's a discussion. Is this, again, another non-obligatory prayer that hasn't been mentioned? Is this prayer, which is done in the duha period, actually a duha prayer? Is it just a generic version of duha? But no, it's a separate entity based on the hadith about the Prophet ﷺ. Whoever prays Fajr, the Fajr prayer in congregation, and then remains in the place that he prayed, in the state of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doing the dhikr of Allah until the sun rises, then prays 2 rak'ah, it will be for him the reward of Hajj and Umrah, completely. So mind-blowing hadith, to be honest. But yes, this is specific for the Ishraq prayer. The majority of scholars take this hadith as authentic, but it's not as strong as we may think. Now, at this point, we went off on a tangent, as we do in LP, and we talked about the use of weak hadith. And we've mentioned hadith many times, but specifically for the weak hadith in this scenario. They can be used, but there's kind of conditions that go along with this. So when we're talking about hadith that establish rulings, rulings essentially, then we can't rely on weak hadith. But when we talk about doing good actions or encouraging people, then weak hadith can be used, and we talked about 3 conditions. The first one is it's usually used to enjoin in good and warding of sinning. Because there's already a basis for doing those things, doing good and avoiding sin. So if a weak hadith comes in and kind of backs that up, that's not a problem. The second is it can't be really weak. It can't be munkar. It can't be mawdu'. It can just be slightly weak or roughly weak. And the third condition is that you kind of have to give a disclaimer that this hadith that we're using is a weak hadith. But actually, when it came down to it, the hadith for the Ishraq prayer is not that weak, to be honest, so we can act by it. And the class position is that it is a separate prayer. It's not part of duha, although it is prayed in the duha period of time. So we're kind of relaxed towards it. But that's the second non-obligatory prayer that we've mentioned that wasn't mentioned in the text. And another prayer is mentioned here, the Salat al-Ham wal-Haja, the prayer of stress and need. The majority of hadith related to this prayer, this topic, are generally weak, but the one that we're using here is a Sahih hadith. So Aisha radiallahu anha said, when anything distressed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he prayed. So very short, sharp hadith, but essentially the Prophet sallallahu, when he was stressed, he prayed. And this, as we know, the Prophet sallallahu was the walking, talking Quran. We have the ayah of Quran here, seek help with steadfastness and prayer. So the solution for kind of stress and difficulty is be steadfast, so practicing patience, calm down, and prayer. And that's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ did. Now, this is a slide. It's not fixed, and I'm happy for people to kind of give me some feedback on this. But we're not too stressed about, there's no specific order here. But if we were to talk about order, at the end of, I'm not sure which session last year, I think Hamza did. So on the right side in the kind of maroon, we did the order. So the Fajr Sunnah, then the Salat al-Khusuf, the Witr prayer, the Salat al-Istisqa, and the Taraweeh prayer. That was the kind of rough guideline here. But in the session in the this year, we then covered in the text all of these, the text and what the Hanbali Madhab also mentioned, and there was a slightly different order that Abu Isa gave. Like I said, we're not overly stressed. We know that roughly, for example, the Sunnah al-Fajr are going to be way high up there, and so will Witr. And the other prayers, for example, Istikhara, which is an individual kind of thing, Salat al-Haja, they will be lower down. So that's just to give you a rough idea where these were covered, a rough idea where they fall in terms of ranking, but I'm not going to emphasize it here because I'll be honest, it's open to interpretation. The next part of the text, back to the text, the prostration for recitation is an actual prayer. So sajda tilawa, the Hanbalis consider this to be a prayer, an act of worship, and it has specific statements, and it opens with a takbir and it closes with a taslim. So we're kind of forming a picture of a prayer here. I'm sure you'll agree. So if it's a prayer, then by definition you need wudu, right? You can't be in a state of janaba, you can't be in a state of ritual impurity. You're going to have to face the qibla, and you're going to have to cover your awrah. So these are all kind of technical parts of a prayer. We've covered this when we've talked about what a prayer is and the prerequisites. And Shaykh Uthaymeen argues when you start to apply the full definition of a prayer, the Hanbali position starts to fall apart. There's no evidence in the Sunnah really of the Prophet ﷺ saying that you have to do taslim or make takbir, but only very general details of a sajda. There is a hadith narrated by Abu Dawood where the Prophet ﷺ made taslim on the way down in the sajda. Made takbir, made takbir on the way down, but there was no mention of taslim. So Shaykh Uthaymeen argues, how can you, we'll accept the point of a takbir going down, but there's no taslim, how can it be a prayer? So this is the sticking point. Do we consider it a prayer? Essentially no. And the position of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah is that sajda tilawa is not to be considered a prayer. So therefore, no wudu is needed. You don't need to face qibla or cover awrah, but I'm sure everybody would. Although having wudu is preferable, but if we're going to be technical about it, it's not a prayer. It's not a prayer. So next part, so it's not a prayer from our point of view, although the Hanbalis consider it so. Is it a sunnah for the reciter? It is. To do sajda tilawa. So Shaykh Uthaymeen basically mentions this as a small point, that this indicates that of course it's not obligatory then, it's a sunnah. Now we're going to discuss this in a bit more detail. The first opinion that this is wajib to do sajda tilawa is based on some kind of broad ayahs of Quran and evidences. So the first one is believers bow down, prostrate yourselves, worship your Lord and do good so that you may succeed. But Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions that this ayah of Quran, wasjudu, is a command. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, why when the Quran is read to them do they not prostrate themselves to God? Meaning that there's criticism of those people who don't prostrate. So we've got a command to prostrate, we've got criticism of those who don't prostrate, and then the third ayah is we've got praise for those who do prostrate. So this all kind of backs up the thought that actually the prostration is wajib. The second opinion is that it's sunnah, as we follow the Hanbali madhab as well. It's not wajib. It's a stronger position, and this is based on a hadith that we're going to come in, because those previous verses were actually directed towards general prostration within the prayer, for example. Whereas here, the hadith where Zayd ibn Thabit was recited upon the Prophet ﷺ, Surah Najm I think it was, and the ayah of sajda came up, and Zayd did not do sajda, and this was in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and he didn't tell him off, he didn't reprimand him, and he didn't tell him to do the sajda later as well. So we've kind of covered all the bases there. So a sajda wasn't done when ordinarily it would be done. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, and we're going to use the example of how the Prophet ﷺ has to tell us if there's something that needs to be done. Back to the hadith of the person who came during the khutbah and sat down, and the Prophet ﷺ said, have you prayed? No, stand and offer 2 rak'ah. The Prophet ﷺ, in middle of a khutbah, told a person to do something. Why? Because it is his job, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to tell us when something needs to be done. And when he doesn't tell us specifically something needs to be done, then that has a ruling in of itself. So Shaykh Uthaymeen makes a learning point here for us. The second evidence is Umar bin Khattab, actually. He was on the minbar, he was given a khutbah, he recited Surah Nahl, and Ayah Sajda came up, and he descended from the minbar and he prostrated. This is Umar radiallahu anhu. The next week, an Ayah Sajda came up again, and he didn't prostrate. And he wanted to make it clear, no doubts. He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not made the prostration for the recitation of an ayah of prostration compulsory, but if we wish, we can do it. And this, remember, is coming from Umar. And as we know throughout the seerah and the sunnah, that when Umar has an opinion on something, it's usually backed up and it's to be followed, really. So it's and this was done in the presence of the Sahaba companions being around him, and no one disagreed or criticized him. So very clear evidence is that actually it's not obligatory, and it's a well-established point. Let's have a look. So the counter arguments are the verses that we have used, but what we said is that these are all kind of, these ayah is to obligate sajda in the prayer. And Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions a small point that actually these ayah mention not just sajda but also ruku'. So there's 2 things being mentioned here. So it's not applied to sajda tilawa. Just at the bottom, the position of Imam al-Hajjawi in the Hanbali school, that is only sunnah for the reciter, is an evidence that the Prophet ﷺ used to make sajda when he sallallahu alaihi wasallam would pass by an ayah of sajda. So this kind of establishes a principle of usul al-fiqh, that the action of the Prophet ﷺ in principle indicates recommendation rather than obligation. And additional information is needed to take it to a higher level. So that was just a side point that Imam al-Hajjawi makes. Now we talk about, so the reciter, we've talked about them. What about the hearer and listener? Actually, aren't they the same thing? So the text is sunnah for the reciter and the one actively listening, but not for the one who merely hears it. So we've got 2 types of people who are hearing. One who is actively listening, the mustami', and the sami', the one who hears. Listen is someone who's, like I said, is actively listening, whereas the hearer is passive. He's not really concentrating. He's not involved. He's just walked past and he's heard it. And two different rulings according to the Hanbalis, which is that the one actively listening should also do the sajda tilawa, whereas the hearer, the one passively listening, just walked past, doesn't have to do sajda tilawa. And the story of Musa and Harun is mentioned. So this ayah of Quran, and Musa or Moses said, "Our Lord, you have given Pharaoh and his chief splendor and wealth in this present life, and here they are, Lord, leading others astray from your path. Our Lord, obliterate their wealth and harden their hearts so they do not believe until they see the agonizing torment." So this is kind of Musa, really asking for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach these guys a lesson, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds, "Your prayers are answered, so stay on the right course and do not follow the path of those who do not know." Now your prayers actually is referring to two people. So sorry, I've got the translation, I've not got the Arabic there. The Arabic makes it very clear it's referring to two people. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't just responding to the dua of Musa, he's responding to Harun, who actively didn't make the dua, but he was saying in the tafsir that the Mufassirin mentioned, is that Harun was saying Ameen when Musa was saying Rabbana. He said Ameen, ay Harun. And so they were referred to, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala referred to both of them and saying he would accept both their du'as, kind of emphasizing that point of someone who's actively involved, listening and involved, is a different ruling to someone who's passive and not really involved. Again, referring to the listener, if the reciter doesn't prostrate, neither does the listener. And the hadith, we've already covered this, where Surah Najm was being recited. Zayd ibn Thabit didn't prostrate, and the Prophet ﷺ didn't prostrate either, and didn't reprimand him either. Now, some people go as far as to say that the reason for this is that this prostration of recitation is actually abrogated, and abrogated as a requirement to be done for all the Mufassal surahs. Now, our counter argument, there's no proof for that really. It's well established in various hadith that sajda tilawa is definitely done for these Mufassal surahs in Juz Amma, and so no, that's not an argument, and we're going to come to where these sajda tilawa are. However, if the Imam generally forgot, then it's okay to remind him. And actually, from time to time, I don't know whether did I write recommended. If it's left from time to time, it acts as a learning point, that it's not obligatory, as Umar radiallahu anhu did from one khutbah to another. I mean, I'd be careful where you try to do this learning point, but yes, so we know that it's sunnah, it's not obligatory, and there are 14 of them, which is our next point. So there are 14 prostrations. The evidence for the prostrations are all from hadith, and these hadith have varying strengths. Some are sahih, some are da'if, some are sahih marfu'an, some are sahih mawqufan. I've gone through some of the kind of definitions, which is good to know when it comes to hadith. But the question that we really have at this point, we have 14 prostrations. All of them are based on hadith. But wait a second, you're saying some are weak. How are we going to use some of these? Well, this brings us on to our next point. There are some hadith which are from companions, which might not fulfill the conditions of authenticity that we would like for such a scenario. However, the legal ruling is given for some of these hadith to be higher than they are. And the reason for that is if the companion who is trustworthy is mentioning something that the Prophet ﷺ said or did, for example, we're talking about sajda tilawa, they couldn't have made it up themselves. And this goes for things to do with the al-ghaib, or things that they can't see, that because the only way that you can know about these things is to get revelation, and the companions don't get revelation. It's only the Prophet ﷺ. So there are certain scenarios, and in this case, where if we're using this hadith to establish places of sajda tilawa, that these things are tawqifi, i.e. they could have only come from the Prophet ﷺ, and that's where the companion must have got it from. So the main thing to take away here is that these prostrations are tawqifi, and we're going to talk about what the actual number is. And you can see here I've listed them all. I'm not going to go through all of them because it's just a direct translation. We can go into why we think it might be a sajda tilawa, what the reasoning is, there something in the meaning, but actually we come back to the point actually that we can't logically deduce always why it says sajda tilawa. We have to just accept that this is a place of sajda tilawa because it's part of the Quran and Sunnah. Now you see here I mentioned 14, which is what the Hanbali madhab say, but actually I've listed 15, and I'll let you work out which is the one that the Hanbalis or which is the one that we've included extra, which will be revealed in a few slides. I wanted to mention a few of these though, just because there were a few points of benefit that we wanted to take. So for example, the third one, Surah Nahl, verse 50, which is Sajda Tilawa. We mentioned one verse number, but usually this verse is at the end of a number of verses that lead up to the Sajda Tilawa. So in this case, it could be a 1, 2, 3 verse sequence. In the case of Surah Nahl, it was verse 49 and 50. But actually, we make the Sajda after 50. So verse 50 is the ayah of Sajda, even though verse 49 is the one that starts off the kind of meaning that we're talking about. So let's quickly read that out. It is to God that everything in the heavens and earth submits. Every beast that moves, even the angels, they are free from arrogance. They fear their Lord above them, and they do as they commanded. So the word sujood is actually mentioned in 49, but the meaning ends in 50, and we do sajda tilawa at 50. Now we could try to work out whether actually we should do it in 49 or should we do it in 50. But this is, as we said, a tawqifi matter, a divine matter. It's not an aqli one. And the Prophet ﷺ prostrated after ayah 50, so that's what we're going to do. And that's where in the Mus'haf you see the symbol indicating sajda tilawa. The next one to discuss was Surah Hajj, because the first couple of sujood tilawa, I think we mentioned 5 or 6 where there's no difference of opinion. So the first 5 there was no kind of difference of opinion. We get to Surah Hajj, this is where we see a slight difference of opinion. Now verse 77 of Surah Hajj, some have said that's the only one, whereas the Hanafi scholars the Hanafi scholars, they say that there's just one. But the Hanbalis and the Shafi say that there are 2, and they add in. Sorry, I've got the numbers the wrong way around. But yes, the Hanafi said that there's 1 in Surah Hajj. The Hanbalis and Shafi say that there are 2, and they include: believers, bow down, prostrate yourselves, worship your Lord, and do good so that you may succeed. So obviously there's a difference of opinion here. The Hadith aren't very clear on this. I mean, based on the kind of interpretation, the tafsir of the ayah, you could make an argument for it. But the stronger position is the majority of scholars that they count this as the ayah of sajda. But clearly there's a difference of opinion, and we're not going to get into arguments about this. The next one, where there's a slight difference of opinion again, is Surah Sad. Actually before that, Surah Al-Sajda is known as Alif Lam Mim Tanzil. This was mentioned because there can be different names for the Sajda Tilawa, and we mentioned quite a few. Now the one that I wanted to mention, Surah Sad, the one that where Dawood makes prostration, and he's mentioned. The scholars differed over this, and a lot of scholars don't include this as Sajda Tilawa, but the Shafis and a certain position in the Hanbali Madhab mention this. But for the Hanafis, the Shafis don't consider this as Sajda Tilawa, but the Hanafis do. But I mentioned at the end, some of the Shafis do include it. That might have been a bit messy, but I'll clear it all up now. So there are 14 sajdas in the text. Remember that Saad is not there. That's the Hanbali position. So the Hanbali position, they consider 2 in Surah Hajj, but they don't include Surah Saad. So there's 14 for them. Why? Because sajda of Saad, according to Hanbalis, is a sajda of Shukr from Dawood, and it's specific to him. Sorry, let me just get a drink. But we have a hadith that Shaykh Uthaymin mentions where this was observed by the Prophet ﷺ. So from the class position, there are 15. We include Saad. We include the 2 from Surah Hajj. The Shafi position is pretty solid on this, and it's the kind of majority position of the contemporary scholars. So, a summary of this: who has 14? The Hanbalis and Hanafis, but they have slightly different variations. So the Hanbalis don't include Surah Saad, but have 2 in Surah Hajj, whereas the Hanafis only have 1 in Hajj, and they include Saad as well. So they've arrived at 14 in 2 different ways, whereas the Shafis 15, and that's what we follow, and that's the class position. I hope that's clear. So some may mention, or some may argue, as Shaykh Uthaymin says, what if someone was to say that there are many verses in the Quran where sujood is mentioned and it's not legislated to make sajda? For example, in Surah Hijr, celebrate the glory of your Lord and be among those who bow down to him, worship your Lord until what is certain comes to you. I mean, you can argue however you want. I mentioned this because it was mentioned by Shaykh Uthaymin, but this is why these questions, they're pointless really, because we need proof on the matter. We need hadith, because it's a tawqifi matter. You can't argue your way in or out of this, and rather it's based on proofs. So the takbir. So this is the class text. One makes the takbir when prostrating and rising back up, then sits and offers taslim, but doesn't do the tashahhud. So the author says that there should be an opening takbir. So question for the class, or for the guys listening: the opening takbir, what's the technical term for it? Because this is how we enter the prayer. Oh, I've just given the answer there. Okay, takbirat ihram. So with the tahrima, according to the Hanbalis, they want the tahrima there, whereas Shaykh Uthaymin says the sajda tilawa isn't a prayer, which is the class position. Therefore, there is no takbir to establish a prayer, because it's just a sajda. But we do have proof that the Prophet ﷺ did do takbir on the way down to sajda. Whether you're standing or sitting, you just say Allahu Akbar and you go in. So this is what's, if it's, so the sajda tilawa, you could have an argument for 3 positions. The first being the Hanbali madhab, making takbir on the way down and on the way back up, and doing the taslim, position 1. The second, which is a class position, takbir on the way down and nothing on the way back up, because the hadith that we mentioned only talked about on the way down, not on the way back up. The third position is no takbir on the way down and no takbir on the way back up. And this, you might think, whose position is that? Actually, this is something that could be argued for, but our class position is the second one. So there's definitely no mention of tashahhud. There's no mention of taslim, except you could argue inside the prayer. So inside the prayer, the sajda tilawa comes up. Yes, you have to make taslim, That's a taslim again. Takbir on the way down, and then takbir on the way back up. And that's the position of the majority of the scholars, and we have a hadith to clearly back this up as well. What do we say in these in the sajda tilawa? Because that's not actually mentioned in the text, but it's very well established when you are in sujood what you should say, and we've covered this many times over the last few years, and had many sessions on Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. When following, so this is based on the ayah, when the following was revealed, glorify the name of your Lord the Most High. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to us, say this in your prostrations. So very clear, no kind of going this way, that way. There are some du'as though that can be used in Sajda Tilawa. There's a, look at the transcribed notes, I've not gone through them. On the top right, just a reminder, you can see that this was mentioned in the chapter 21, lesson 27, where you can see some of these. But the minimum, the most important thing to say is Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. If someone adds to this, that's fine. Next, we talk about the situation where the Hanbalis say that it's disliked for the person to recite a verse of prostration. And where is that? In the silent prayer. So the Imam leading the prayer, they're saying that it's makruh to prostrate or to do a verse of prostration and to prostrate therein. So karaha has a very specific meaning, commonly kind of translated as disliked. But you have to be careful how this word is used and what time period we're referring to. So the early scholars or the first generations of companions and Muslims, this would be seen as something very, very severe, something that you could get punished if you do it. And actually, if you look at the Quran, this word is used. So in a long surah, in Surah Isra, it talks about many evil actions, killing, taking orphans' property, and these actions are described as makruha, detested. But when we look at the actions we're describing, and we're saying makruh, we're talking about some haram actions. Now, this is important to remember. Shaykh Uthaymeen makes a learning point here, and says we kind of have to talk about and bear in mind in what time period or what context this word is being used in. Not specifically to do with Sajda Tilawa, but he goes on to say it's makruh, as the Hanbali madhab say, for someone to recite a Sajda Tilawa, a verse for Sajda Tilawa in silent prayer, so in the Asr and Dhuhr prayer, is a big statement by the Hanbalis. And how do they justify such a big statement, a legal statement? Two things they say. One is that if he reads the ayah and decides not to prostrate, he's done a bad thing, because really, we said it's a sunnah to prostrate, and he should do. And he's missing it, so that's not a good thing. So that's the first thing. Secondly, if he does go into sajda, he's going to confuse everyone around him. People are going to start saying subhanallah and think he's missed things up, or will cause problems and confusion. Shaykh Uthaymeen says, well, we're making a big statement, we need evidence, you're trying to establish a legal position based on it's a bit subjective really. So one way around this would be you could tell people before the prayer that there's going to be sajda tilawa, or you could raise your voice as you approach the verse in question. There's various ways around it. So Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions some of those, and Abu Isa did as well in the class. But we're going to be fair. In today's day and age, certainly in the UK, if you were to do it in a normal mosque, you would cause confusion, and it's a valid point. Then don't recite the Sajda Tilawa. Don't recite a verse where you're going to cause confusion. It's fairly simple, really. So we don't see it as makruh, and that's the class position. If he does it, fine, there's no problem. So yeah, hopefully that's clear. Those praying behind the Imam must follow him in all of the prayers. Now, this is slightly problematic because the Hanbalis have mentioned it's makruh to do the verse of prostration, to recite a verse of prostration and prostrate within a silent prayer. And then they mention, but you must follow him in all other prayers. What are they implying? Are we implying at some point that you don't follow the Imam? So this is a problematic issue because we know that actually when the Imam starts the prayer, you follow. And as the Prophet ﷺ says, when he prostrates, prostrate. And that includes Sajda Tilawa as well. And so we kind of, have to be very clear here. And this is a bit of a hole that the Hanbalis have dug themselves. But yes, we know that you follow the Imam. Simple. What's going on here behind the Imam? So we've finished Sajda Tilawa. We're going to move on to the next part. It is recommended to offer the prostration of thankfulness when a new blessing presents itself or harm is averted. It is, if offered during a prayer, it will be invalidated other than for the one who is ignorant or forgetful. So this is a sunnah, and it's a sajda. It's a good act, rewarded. If you don't do it, not a problem. There's no sin. And this sajda shukr, Sheikh Uthaymeen explains, is recognizing the blessing. And there's practical aspects to this. So you kind of express your thanks. Well, you recognize the blessing, then there's the expressing your thanks, and then you kind of prove it. And we know in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, talk about the blessings of your Lord. So we should kind of express our thanks. And Sajda Shukr is a very specific form of showing thanks. There's many other examples in the Sunnah. But specifically, the Sajda Shukr is, for example, we do it when a new blessing presents itself. So it's not, this Sajda Shukr isn't something that's done all the time. We have very few narrations or instances when the Prophet ﷺ actually did it, maybe 2 or 3 in the Sunnah. And actually, if you look in the Quran where this has been mentioned, just the once, I think, in Surah Sad. So Dawood, when he did, actually we mentioned that already, haven't we? And actually, if we really think about it, it's not possible for us to enumerate the continuous blessings that we have all the time. We'd be in sajda all the time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, if you tried to calculate Allah's favors, you could never calculate them. So very clear that this sajda isn't to be used for your day-to-day blessings and issues. Otherwise, it'd be difficult. It's to be used in rare occasions. And the Sheikh and Sheikh Uthaymeen and Abu Isa mention a few. For example, someone who's successful in an exam, a really big part of their life, a game changer, for example, a victory for the Muslims in a particular issue. Someone gets good news, they've just had a child. These are the things that we're talking about. And also it's recommended to be done when harm is averted. Sorry. And we give a few other examples. So someone was involved in a crash, and he escapes without being harmed, and he would do a sajda of shukr. Another one is a house is on fire and he's managed to save himself, and his family, maybe not even the house, but he makes a sajda, etc. There's many examples there. An example from the Sunnah that was mentioned, when Ali ibn Abi Talib was fighting the Khawarij, and he found out one of the key members, one of the founders, was killed in this battle, and he did the Sajda Shukr. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that this person was part of the Khawarij. He was, I think he insulted the Prophet ﷺ. I've not put the story here, but I think this was the same person who, when the Prophet ﷺ was dividing the spoils of war and dividing things, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, be fair. And the Prophet ﷺ said, well, if I'm not going to be fair, who is? He was actually quite angry about this, and the Sahaba weren't happy about this either. So when Ali heard that this person had been killed in this battle, it confirmed that for him anyway, that this battle was valid. It was done for the right cause, and this was confirmed by this person dying or being killed, and he did Sajda Shukr. And there's another example of Ka'b ibn Malik when he missed the opportunity to go to jihad, and went through a tough time until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed his tawbah in the Quran, and he did Sajda Shukr. So big occasions, basically, not done for everyday little random things, but we should be thankful for all Allah's blessings. So it's not a prayer, there's no wudu, takbir, tashahhud, nothing. But how does this differ, for example, from Sajda Tilawa? This can't be done in the prayer, so it can't be done in Salah. And this is the next part that the Hanbali Hanbalis mentioned. If offered during the prayer, it will be invalidated, other than for the one who is ignorant or forgetful. So the prayer would be invalidated if someone randomly in the prayer thinks of a blessing and says, I'm going to do Sajda Shukr, gets overexcited. However, in two situations it may not be invalidated, is if he's ignorant of the ruling that it can't be done in the prayer, or someone forgot. And this is, we've come across this scenario a number of times, and this ayah has been used because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the believers say, Lord, do not take us to task if we forget or make mistakes. So a well-established principle in our religion. So the next big portion now we're going to talk about are the prohibited times of prayer. So the prohibited times for general prayer are 5. From true dawn until sunrise, from sunrise until it has risen above the horizon the length of a spear, from the zenith until it starts to descend, after praying Asr until the beginning of sunset, from the beginning of sunset until it is completed. So there are 5 kind of scenarios, 5 factors here. We're going to divide these into 2. So in principle, non-obligatory prayers, we should know, are to be prayed anytime, whenever, wherever. Due to the generality of the meanings, we're going to mention one here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, believers, bow down, prostrate yourselves, worship your Lord, and do good so that you may succeed. There's no limit here. We are able to pray wherever, whenever we want. So if someone's going to say that you can't pray at this time, we need evidences. And also the Prophet ﷺ said, when he was returning a favor to a man, the Prophet ﷺ said to him, ask for whatever you wish as a form of payment. And the man said to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I want your companionship in paradise. The Prophet ﷺ said to him, okay, anything else other than that? The man replied, no, that is what I want, Ya Rasulullah, nothing more, nothing less. And the Prophet ﷺ said, then help me to help you achieve this by doing lots of prostration, sujood. So this is talking about the nafil prayer. Do lots of it. So let's talk about these prohibited times and what the evidences are. So the first one is from true dawn until sunrise. So what is the true dawn? The first Fajr is called the false dawn, unlike the true dawn. So the false dawn comes first, then the true dawn comes after. The false dawn is a time in which the prayer is not established. So this is not the time where Fajr or prayer is established. And this is known as the Adhan of Bilal. May Allah be pleased with him. It's like a warning kind of call. The second Adhan is the actual Fajr Adhan, the true dawn, Fajr. So mainly you see this in Muslim countries, which is the start of the Fajr prayer time. So Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen summarizes this to differentiate. He basically mentions, how do you differentiate between the false and true dawn? The false dawn starts nothing, it just wakes you up. The true dawn is what initiates the prayer time for Fajr. So he mentions some helpful differences to differentiate between the two. The true dawn, there's no darkness after the true dawn, it just gets lighter and lighter. Whereas the false dawn, there's initial light and then darkness reappears. The true dawn is connected to the horizon. Whereas a false dawn is connected in the middle of the sky. There's a bit of a gap, and it's a kind of diffused light. The false dawn is going from back to front, whereas a true dawn goes from left to right, so across the horizon. So the Hanbali position is that the true dawn, rather than from Salat al-Fajr, and this is based on a weak hadith, and we're going to differentiate here in a second. So guys, let's see if you're paying attention. Out of the two images there, which is the true dawn, which is the false dawn? I'll give you about 30 seconds to give your answer. So one is a true dawn, one is a false dawn. And the true dawn starts Fajr, whereas the false dawn doesn't start anything. Any answers? Let's have a look. No? Okay, fair enough. So the true dawn is B. Yes, Mesa. Yes, Ruhi. So the true dawn, yes, is B. Whereas A, I mean, A looks really bright, I have to say, right? But yes, A is the false dawn, B is the true dawn. And the thing that really helps me, because we mentioned those 3 points, I'm not able to apply all those points, but certainly the last point that was mentioned, where it goes from side to side rather than up and down the light, is the one that helps me differentiate the two. So this image here, we're gonna come back to it a few times. So Fajr, forget the degrees and angles there. I'm not gonna get into that. That's above my pay grade. So the true dawn starts at Fajr, and then at sunrise, Fajr ends, and then you have this kind of little red period, which is the makruh time. So that's the makruh time. And then you have the Duha prayer. So we mentioned the time of Duha. We said it's 15 minutes after sunrise, then Duha starts, all the way up to 15 minutes before kind of around the zenith. So the zenith is Zawal time, that's what we said, Zawal time. So you've got a kind of 15-minute period there, and then Dhuhr starts. So we'll go into this in a bit more detail. But yes, Amal also got the right answer. Musab, well done. Okay, maybe I made it a bit too easy. Right, so the Hanbalis mentioned that the true dawn and the Fajr, well, we're going to say it's two different things. So let's just look at this. When the Fajr starts, there is no prayer except for the 2 units of Fajr. So we need to pick on this hadith, this point here. And Shaykh Uthaymeen talks about a grammatical issue. And we've mentioned this a lot of times when it comes to the lam of negation. So lam could negate various things, the actual existence of something, the validity of something, or the perfection of something. Now here, fala salata, based on this hadith, the la salata could mean there is no prayer, as in it doesn't exist, the prayer isn't valid, or the prayer isn't complete, i.e. it's not perfect. Which one of it's going to be? Well, we know that it's not the first one because there is a prayer, and so we're going to say it's going to be one of the other two. The prayer isn't valid, or it's not complete. And the Hanbalis are basically saying, using this hadith to say that the prayer being offered is invalid, other than the 2 sunnah of Salat al-Fajr. Shaykh Uthaymeen, based on this authentic hadith, the correct position is that the prohibition is not linked to the time. It's linked to once you've prayed Fajr. So this is a really important point. I led up to it, but I don't know whether it's clear. The time isn't the issue here. Once you've prayed your Fajr prayer, then the makruh period starts for any other prayer. Does that make sense? The reason why is this hadith below. There is no prayer that can be offered after the Fajr prayer until the sun rises. So this what establishes the makruh period. So I hope that makes sense. The first period that we're talking about, that's going to be a time that is recommended not to pray, is from the time you pray Fajr until the sunrise. Does that make sense? Now the second part, from sunrise until it has risen above the horizon the length of a spear. Now this is the second period. So the appearance of the disc, this is the beginning, until it gets above the horizon, until the height of a spear. So the height of a spear is a visual description. We don't really use spears these days, but it's the equivalent of, again, 15 to 20 minutes. Now, you know what, I've mentioned 15 minutes various times for sunrise and the zawal period, etc., etc. But this will vary depending on what part of the world you're on, what part of the equator you're on. So certainly here, 15 minutes is the kind of number that we're using. And then the third period is from the zenith until it starts to descend. So this is when the sun is at its highest point until it starts to fall. This period is almost like the sun's in a stationary period, and at its highest point called zawal. This is a time when you're not allowed to pray again. This is a 10-15 minute period. And the evidence for this third time being prohibited is a hadith of Prophet ﷺ, where he mentions there were 3 times at which Allah's Messenger ﷺ forbade us to pray or bury our dead when the sun begins to rise until it is fully up, when the sun is at its height at midday and until it passes over the meridian, and when the sun draws near to settling until it sets. The fourth period is after praying the Asr prayer until the beginning of sunset. So here the Hanbalis have said something slightly different, and we agree with them. After praying Asr, whether you pray at the earliest time or the later time, after Asr is the fourth prohibited period to pray, and we'll talk about what you can pray and can't pray, but generally a makruh time. So this could be a significant portion of the day, and from the beginning of sunset until it is completed. So this is the final one. So from beginning of sunset until it is completed. So again, this 10-15 minute period just before Maghrib is again a period where you should avoid praying. So I've color coded things here because remember I said that there's going to be 2 groups here. The first group is in green, the second group is in orange. The green period is period that's kind of lightly makruh, or whereas the orange is kind of intense periods, and I've got a diagram that we can also look at. So the first of this is after you pray Salat al-Fajr until the sun starts to rise. That's the first period. The second is the sun rising until it's clear above the horizon. The third is when the sun is at its highest point. The fourth is after you pray Salat al-Asr until the sun begins to set. The fifth is the sun setting itself. So those 3 short times I've put as red dots. So the sun rising, the zenith point, and the sun setting. Those are the 3 dots. They're the short periods. They're the intense haram periods, as mentioned in the class. Then you have the kind of 2 longer periods depending on when you pray Fajr and when you pray Asr. But both periods, after you've prayed those prayers, you have the kind of makruh or prohibited time to pray. And those are the slightly longer, normally, periods, and I put them in green, and I put arrows to show what kind of time period those could potentially cover. I hope that makes sense. The diagram looked really good at the time, but I don't know whether it's confusing you now. So why have we? I mean, we mentioned some hadith, but the general principle here, as Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions, is this is what has been told by the Prophet ﷺ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us that these are periods of time that we should avoid praying. And that's the end of the discussion really. We can go into some of the wisdoms behind this, and one of them is that especially those 3 haram periods, those intense periods, when the sun's going up, sun's going down, the sun's at its highest point, the mushrikeen used to worship the sun god, and obviously this is shirk. This is massive issue, and essentially when it comes to the mushrikeen, we wherever possible want to differentiate ourselves from them. And so certainly if that's the time that they used to pray, that's the time we will avoid praying. So that's the general principle there. However, there's a caveat, and there's a number of them. According to the Hanbalis, it is permissible to make up missed obligatory prayers during all these times. So we're talking about the qada prayers, something that you've missed or the time has passed, and it refers to something that's recently been missed, yesterday, today, not something from a long time ago. And we mentioned what happens with those. I won't discuss that now though. So as an example, we mentioned if you are in the prohibited time after Asr, and it's quite a long prohibited time, and you remember that I've not prayed Dhuhr. So you've prayed Asr, then you realise, oh no, I've not prayed Dhuhr. What do? It's a prohibited time. The Hanbalis say it's permissible to pray for you to make up the obligatory prayers, because the Prophet said, whoever forgets a prayer, let him pray as soon as he remembers it. We know this. And even if it's in this period of time. So it's an authentic hadith, it's a principle that's well established. And it's, yeah. And the point that I mentioned right at the bottom is that the obligatory prayers are a debt to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're owed, they need to be paid. And so, because it's obligatory upon us, you've remembered it, you need to pray as soon as you realise. So we mentioned obligatory prayers, very clear, I hope that makes sense. The next part is, they mention it is also permissible to perform the 2 units of tawaf during the 3 short times. So the 3 short times are all to do with the sun movements. Sunrise, sunset, sun at its highest point. For the Hanbalis, it's permissible in the 3 prohibited times to do the 2 rak'ah of tawaf. Based on the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, O tribe of Banu Abd Manaf, do not prevent anyone from performing tawaf around this house and salah, whichever hour it is of the night or day. Shaykh Uthaymeen says the apparent meaning of this hadith is that actually, not just to do with tawaf, any prayer in Masjid Haram is allowed to be done regardless of time. So this is actually more general than we initially thought, and actually backs up our class position, which we're going to come to. If there's a reason to pray in any of these time periods, then you're allowed to pray. So that's the general principle. A small point to make, Imam Hajawi in the text, he mentions the tawaf during the 3 short times. Why did he mention the 3 short times? The point to take away from here, if he's mentioning the 3 short times, it kind of covers the 2 long times as well, because they're less intense. And it can also indicate that there's a matter of difference of opinion within the school. So it's just to explain the wording there, really. The next point, so we mentioned obligatory prayers, making that up. We mentioned the tawaf, the 2 units of prayer related to that, and the other one is the congregational prayer. So if you've prayed your prayer and you attend the masjid, then it's allowed for you to join in the congregational prayer. And the evidence for this is the Prophet ﷺ was praying Salat al-Fajr in the masjid, one day in Mina, and then he finished and there were 2 men standing who hadn't joined in the prayer. And he ﷺ noticed and asked them, what prevented you from praying with us? And they said, basically, we prayed at home. The Prophet ﷺ said, well, don't just stand there. When you come to the masjid, pray with us, and it'll be a supererogatory prayer for you, i.e. a nafil prayer for you. You'll be rewarded for it. So this is a very clear statement. Why is this an issue, by the way? Because we said, once you've prayed Fajr, the makruh, the prohibited time period for not praying has started for you. And therefore, you would assume, actually, maybe I shouldn't join in the prayer. But the Prophet ﷺ is making a very clear indication that actually, if you're in the masjid, you're to join in. So that's the evidence for being able to pray in the congregational prayer. Some went further and said, actually, this hadith gives us a lot more information than it may seem. It would possibly indicate that you can pray at home. You don't need to come to the mosque to do it in Jama'ah. However, our reply was that the evidences for praying in the masjid, the harshness of some of these evidences is so clear that as per the principles in when it comes to hadith, is that if you've got very clear hadith, they supersede anything that isn't as clear, basically. And there's a long hadith that I'm sure you're all well aware of, where the Prophet ﷺ basically said, if I could put someone in position to lead the prayer, I would go out, gather some wood, and I would burn the houses of the people praying at home. I mean, it's an intense hadith, really. And this could be, the people could be praying Fajr at home, by the way, not just sleeping. We know to harm a Muslim, the property, is a haram, it's a big issue, very serious crime. But for the Prophet ﷺ to even think or mention something like this must indicate the importance of praying in Jama'ah in the masjid. So the class position, and many scholars based on this said it was obligatory. Our class position, as per the majority of scholars, is highly recommended to attend the masjid, but not necessarily an obligation. So certainly, we have to use this hadith in its proper way. What are the exceptions? To summarize, it is obligatory prayers when you remember to perform 2 units of tawaf, to repeat the congregational prayer. The Hanbali say, besides this, there is nothing else. Even if they have a specific reason behind them, you are not to pray in these prohibited times. Now, the text that we're covering is mentioned, this is in Zad al-Mustaqni by Imam al-Hajjawi. So this is a summarized Hanbali text. Shaykh Uthaymeen says, in the Hanbali school itself, though, because obviously there's a lot more in the Hanbali school than just this text, there are further prayers that have been mentioned. The 4th prayer that would be exempt is, the Hanbalis mention, is the sunnah of Salatul Dhuhr, in the case where you combine Dhuhr and Asr. So there's 2 types of combining. You can combine Dhuhr and Asr in the Dhuhr time, and you can combine Dhuhr and Asr in the Asr time. In the scenario that you combine Dhuhr and Asr in the Dhuhr time, the Hanbali say that you're okay to pray the sunnah of Dhuhr after praying the Asr. Remember we said that the one of the prohibited times is after you pray Asr. So they're saying that there's an exception here. You can pray the sunnah of Salatul Dhuhr. I hope that makes sense. Another exception that they mention is someone who walks in on the day of Jummah and the Imam is giving the khutbah should pray 2 units Tahiyyat al-Masjid, even if it's in Zawal time. The 6th exception that they give is the 2 sunnah before Salatul Fajr. I'll be honest, I did not understand this one. And I think Abu Isa mentioned we just had to go with it. If someone understood and can make this point clear, I'd appreciate it. The 6th exception is what I'm talking about, is the 2 sunnah before Salatul Fajr. It is an exception because we said in general there is no prayer after the true dawn until Salatul Fajr. I think that's what the Hanbali say. Their period is the true dawn until sunrise. I don't know. I try to get my head around this as well. The exception is obviously the 2 sunnah of Fajr. I just accept it. If someone comes up with a good way to explain this, then great. It's in lesson 31. But yes, that's what the Hanbali say. The 7th exception is Salatul Janazah. The Salatul Janazah is also prayed in the prohibited times. So if you prayed Asr and the Janazah is brought in, then you will pray over it due to the general ruling for obligating the prayer upon the deceased. Because it needs to be done straight away. It's one of the rights of the deceased. And we mentioned how we deal with hadith that some are general, some are specific. And we said normally we give more precedence to a prohibition that's given over a general command, because we want to avoid the sin of a prohibition. So I'm mentioning an example here. So for example, Tahiyyat al-Masjid after praying Salat al-Asr. We have 2 hadith. If any one of you enters the masjid, he should pray 2 rak'ah before sitting. That's for Tahiyyat al-Masjid. That's a general hadith. But we have the other hadith, there is no prayer after Asr until the sun has set. So this is saying that actually what happens if you enter the masjid after Asr? What should you do in this scenario? So the first hadith is a command. If you enter the masjid, you should pray 2 rak'ah before sitting. So there is a general thing that's mentioned here, the time, and the specific is the prayer, the Tahiyyat al-Masjid. Whereas the prohibition here, there is no prayer. So we're talking about the second one. There is no prayer. So the general here is the prayer, no prayer after Asr, and specific is the time, so Salat al-Asr time. So according to Hanbalis, if you go with avoiding the prohibition, you're going to give more importance to not praying Tahiyyat al-Masjid after Salat al-Asr. So that's how they come to that ruling. So they've given precedence to the prohibition here. Oops, I've gone backwards. So Shaykh Uthaymeen discusses. Wait a second. You've given certain allowances, exceptions, which actually weakens your whole defense for not allowing people to pray in these prohibited times. So you've allowed a few cases, you've not allowed the rest. On what basis? Because the reason why we don't want to pray during these periods is we don't want to be similar to the mushrikeen. As I mentioned before, we want to avoid emulating them. But no one goes out of their way that has a reason to pray in these periods and emulate the mushrikeen. It doesn't make sense, it's not valid. And so from our point of view, if there is a reason to pray, then it can be prayed in these prohibited times. And an example that the Shaykh gives is if a person makes wudu to do salah and he's in this prohibited time, it's permissible for him to pray because there's a reason for him to do it. He's done wudu, he wants to pray 2 units, and there's a reason for it. He's not doing it to emulate the mushrikeen, right? But as Shaykh Uthaymeen says, if a person walked in, he has no wudu, he needs to do wudu, and then he goes in and specifically does wudu or enters a masjid at that time. No, I'm not really explaining that clearly. So that the first scenario I said was fine. Oh, I've messed out the other one. Oh, great. What's not allowed to happen is I'm trying to think of an example now. So if there's a reason to pray in the prohibited time, this is absolutely allowed according to the class position. And if it so happens that you do something like wudu and 2 units of prayer you read, that's a valid reason to do so, and you can pray. Whereas according to Hanbalis, it wouldn't be allowed. So I think hopefully that makes sense. What time is it? 9:30. Now guys, the next part, so we've actually finished the official text. The class positions I'm going to come and do now at the end of this. In lesson 32, we went through in super speed fashion the kind of differences between the nafil and the non-obligatory and the obligatory prayers. I'm not going to go through this, but I'm giving a disclaimer here. All of this is important, good to know, general benefits, and there will be questions in the exam related to this section. I am going to go through 1 or 2 where we differ from what Shaykh Uthaymeen does. So Shaykh Uthaymeen it's a very nice summary, and actually the whole lesson 32, Abu Isa doesn't spend actually too much time. He goes through, I think there's 31 points that he makes, and it's very beneficial. So I'm going to go through some of the ones where he mentioned slight differences. Let's have a look. So one of them was the nafil prayer are permissible inside of the Kaaba. As for the obligatory prayers, they are not. And that is the position of the Hanbali school. Now, I can't remember when we did this, but we establish, as per Shaykh Uthaymeen's position, that there is no difference, and the class position is that you can pray non-obligatory and obligatory prayers within the Kaaba. So that was one. You can basically say all the other points we essentially agree with. There was one that another one coming up. It is permissible to be led by a child. So I think we're talking about the nafil prayer. Yeah, sorry, nafil prayer here. So a baligh, so someone, a child, a baligh, a mature person, an adult, to be led by a child in nafil prayers, unlike the obligatory prayer. Shaykh Uthaymeen disagrees and says that even an obligatory prayer can be led by a child if there's no one better to lead it. So that's another disagreement we have there. Now this was a portion of the text where the translation needs to be looked at. So I've put it in green. It is permissible for the one who's doing nafil prayer to lead the one who's doing an obligatory one. And we talked about Taraweeh. But essentially the class position is correct. So I'd rather focus on the class position, which is a person who's praying obligatory can lead someone who's not. That's we know that. And the one who's not leading the obligatory prayer, praying the nafil prayer, can lead the one who's praying obligatory. Both are acceptable. So just an example of that one that comes to mind. We mentioned the class Taraweeh. As we know, Taraweeh in the masajid are prayed. Someone might have missed the Fajr, the Isha prayer, congregation Isha prayer. They arrive, the Imam's praying Taraweeh. He will join to pray his obligatory Isha prayer while they are reading their Nafil Taraweeh prayer. This is acceptable. On the other hand, we mentioned the hadith where it's the other way around. So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned to those two men who were standing in Mina, he said, you guys have prayed Fajr at home, but if you're here in the masjid and it's congregational prayer, you can join in with and treat it as a nafil prayer. So again, I think that shows that as an example. So it can go both ways. And I think there's no other major differences. So there were 31 points, very beneficial, good to read through them. I'm not going to go through them now because it's not officially part of the text as such. And this is the text. Now you can see that I have put a line through areas where we have disagreed. So for example, the Sajda Tilawa, we said it's not a prayer, so I've cancelled that out. There are 14 prostrations. Well, there are for some madhahib, but for our class position, we're following the Shafis, it's 15. He offers a taslim in Sajda Tilawa. Well, no, we don't follow that, so I've crossed that out. It is disliked for the Imam to recite a verse of prostration. We said, actually it's not disliked, so we'll cross that out. And all these things that are crossed out, the vast majority, as you can see, we of course agree. And this is our tabulated summary. So the slides will be released, as Shazad said at the start of the session. And what I'm also going to do is get hold of Hamza and Rayhan's tabulated summary, so we can add it to the big document that we've got over the last 10 years, and this will be added to them. So these are the official class positions. If you notice anything not quite right, please let me know in the group before I release this as part of the tabulated summaries. So just to finally go through this, please put any questions down if you have any while I go through this. So the first section, Dhuha prayer, is a sunnah. Minimum of 2 units. There is no maximum, although the recommended upper limit is 8. Its time is from the end of the prohibited time until just before the moment of zawal. So the end of the prohibited time for after sunrise. Sajda Tilawa, the prostration for recitation is sunnah for the reciter and the one actively listening, but not for the one who merely hears it. If the reciter doesn't prostrate, neither does the listener. There are 15 prostrations, 2 within Surah Al-Hajj. One makes the takbir when prostrating and rising back up. One makes the takbir when prostrating. Shouldn't really say and rising back up. It is not treated as a prayer, so I'll have to have a look at that one. It is advisable for the Imam to avoid reciting a verse of prostration in a silent prayer. But if he does so, there is no harm. Those praying behind the Imam must follow him in all prayers, of course. Sajda Shukr, it is recommended to offer the prostration of thankfulness when a new blessing presents itself or harm is averted. It is offered during a prayer. If offered during a prayer, it will be invalidated other than for the one who is ignorant or forgetful. The prohibited times. There are 5. From the true dawn until sunrise. From true dawn until sunrise. I'm going to have to change that. What do you think, guys? From true dawn until sunrise. I think that should be... I think that needs to be worded differently, because that's according to the Hanbalis, right? We said after Salat al-Fajr. So how do I word that? I'll come back to that. From sunrise until it has risen above the horizon, the length of a spear. From the zenith until it starts to descend. From after praying Asr until the beginning of sunset. So that would make sense. So after Asr until praying of the beginning of sunset. So after praying Fajr until the beginning of sunrise. Would that make sense? Yes, I think Ruhi's with me. From the beginning of sunset until it is completed. Okay, so it's permissible to pray if there is a specific reason for a prayer. Specific reasons include making up missed obligatory prayers, performing the 2 units of tawaf, to complete the congregational prayer. This is all according to Hanbalis, and we made many other valid examples. It is not allowed to offer prayers without a valid reason during the prohibited time. So this is a key point right at the end. It is not allowed to offer prayers without a valid reason. If you've got a reason, right, you can go ahead during the prohibited times. So I think that one big difference I need to make there. I think Ruhi's with me. Mesa, let me know what you think as well, because once I've done this, that's it for this year. So that was the last revision session, guys. Exam details will be revealed in due course. And yes, year 11 is around the corner, and we will inshallah hopefully start that soon as well. I'll give about a minute just to see if there's any questions or any issues before we end the session, inshallah. Okay, so I think like Ruhi said, I think Mesa's with me on this one. So yes, I will be changing that. So hopefully in the tabulated summaries that will be reflected. I think that's it today. It was a long session with Maghrib in between, but hopefully it was beneficial. If there was any mistakes that you noticed afterwards, please let me know. Please let the team know. I ask for forgiveness for that, and looking forward to the new year. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.